Let yourself settle now into this quiet moment. Feel the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders, like morning mist rising from still water. Tonight, as the world outside grows soft and dim, we journey together through a story. A story of courage wrapped in gentleness, of thunder delivered in whispers, of a life that moved like a river through the landscape of history, reshaping everything it touched. Close your eyes if you wish. Breathe slowly. Let the darkness behind your eyelids become a canvas where the past can unfold in all its quiet beauty. Tonight, we remember Martin Luther King Jr., not with fanfare or spectacle, but with the same peaceful reverence one might show when walking through a garden at twilight, noticing each flower, each stone placed carefully along the path. His life was extraordinary, yes, but it was built from ordinary moments, ordinary choices made sacred by their repetition and their purpose. So rest now, let your breathing slow, and as you drift between waking and sleeping, let this story wash over you like gentle rain on leaves. Each word, a soft tap against the window of memory. Part 1. The Beginning. A child in Atlanta. The year was 1929. The month was January, cold and crystalline, in the way that winter settles over the American South, sharp at dawn, softening by afternoon into something almost warm. On the 15th day of that January, in a modest Victorian house on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia, a child was born into a world that was both beautiful and broken. They named him Michael King Jr. after his father, though years later, both father and son would take the name Martin Luther, inspired by the great reformer who had stood for conscience centuries before. But on that January day, he was simply a baby, wrapped in blankets, held in his mother's arms, unaware of the weight of history that would one day rest upon his shoulders. Auburn Avenue, Sweet Auburn, they called it, was the beating heart of Black Atlanta. Even in the grip of segregation, even as the Jim Crow laws pressed down upon the South like a heavy stone, this street pulsed with life. There were grocery stores and insurance companies, barbershops where men gathered to talk and laugh, beauty parlors fragrant with pressing oils and possibility. There were churches, so many churches, their steeples reaching upward like prayers made solid, their bells marking the rhythm of the week. The King family home sat solid and graceful on that street, a house that spoke of stability, of middle-class respectability hard-won in a society that begrudged such things to people of color. Young Martin, let us call him that now, would grow up within those walls, surrounded by love and expectation in equal measure. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a man of powerful presence, a Baptist minister whose voice could shake the rafters of Ebenezer Baptist Church. He was called Daddy King by many, and he carried himself with a dignity that refused to be diminished by segregation's daily humiliations. He had grown up poor in rural Georgia, had known sharecropping's bitter harvest, had pulled himself up through education and faith. He was stern, sometimes unbending, but he loved his family with a fierceness that was itself a form of protection in a dangerous world. Martin's mother, Alberta Williams King, moved through life with a quieter grace. She was educated, refined, the daughter of a prominent minister herself. She played the organ at Ebenezer Baptist Church, her fingers drawing hymns from the keys, filling the sanctuary with music that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the walls. She was gentle with her children, offering a softer counterbalance to her husband's intensity. In her presence, young Martin learned that strength could be quiet, that power did not always need to raise its voice. There were siblings too, an older sister, Willie Christine, who watched over Martin with protective care, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel, who would follow after. The three children filled that Auburn Avenue house with the ordinary chaos of childhood, running footsteps, laughter echoing off high ceilings, the smell of their grandmother's cooking drifting up from the kitchen. But even in childhood, even within the protective circle of family, Martin could not be entirely sheltered from the realities of the segregated South. The world outside the house on Auburn Avenue was divided, marked by signs that proclaimed white only, and colored by customs and laws that sought to teach black children that they were somehow less, somehow unworthy. One of Martin's earliest memories, one that would stay with him always, came when he was about 6 years old. He had a friend, a white boy, and they played together with the easy intimacy of children who know nothing yet of the world's harsh categories. But one day, the boy's mother told Martin he could no longer come to their house, could no longer play with her son. The reason was simple and terrible. Martin was colored. He ran home, confused and hurt, and his mother gathered him close. She tried to explain, tried to make sense of something that made no sense. The history of slavery, the Civil War, the emancipation that had freed the bodies but not yet freed the society. She told him that he was as good as anyone, that he must never let anyone make him feel inferior. But the wound had been opened, that first awareness that the world saw him differently, judged him by his skin rather than his heart. These experiences accumulated slowly, like sediment settling in a stream. There was the day his father took him to buy shoes, and the clerk told them to move to the back of the store if they wanted service. Daddy King stood up, took his son's hand, and walked out, declaring that they would buy shoes sitting down or not at all. There was the time Martin rode the bus and watched his father refuse to move when ordered to give up his seat. These moments taught young Martin that dignity was something you carried within yourself, something no law could take away if you refused to surrender it. But childhood was not all lessons in injustice. There was joy too, deep and sustaining. There were summer evenings when the heat loosened its grip, and families sat on porches, talking and laughing as darkness fell. There were Sunday mornings at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the congregation's voices rose together in songs that seemed to hold all the sorrow and all the hope of generations. There were books, so many books, for Martin was a voracious reader, hungry for knowledge, devouring words the way some children devoured candy. He was bright, precociously so. He entered public school at age 5 and moved quickly through his classes. He skipped the 9th grade and entered Booker T. Washington High School at age 13. His teachers recognized something in him. A quickness of mind, yes, but also a depth of thought unusual in one so young. He could see connections, understand complexities, hold multiple truths in his mind at once without losing himself in confusion. And he could speak. Oh, how he could speak. Even as a young teenager, Martin discovered the power of words, the way they could be shaped and arranged to move people, to make them see things differently. He joined the debate team, competed in oratorical contests. In one competition, he gave a speech titled The Negro and the Constitution, reflecting even then on the gap between American ideals and American reality. On the bus ride home, he and his teacher were forced to give up their seats to white passengers. They stood for 90 miles, and Martin, having just spoken of constitutional rights, tasted the bitterness of those rights denied. These contradictions, the beauty and the injustice, the Christian teachings of love and the daily realities of hate, the democratic promises and the segregated truths. These would become the tension that defined his life, the question his entire ministry would seek to answer. How do we make real the dream America claims to hold? But that work was still ahead. For now, he was simply a bright boy in Atlanta, reading late into the night, asking questions that had no easy answers, beginning to sense that his life might be claimed by something larger than himself, though he did not yet know what that calling would be. Part 2. The Making of a Minister. At 15, Martin Luther King Jr. entered Morehouse College, the distinguished historically black institution in Atlanta that had educated his father and his grandfather before him. It was 1944, and the world was at war. But within the quiet campus, another kind of transformation was taking place, the transformation of a curious, questioning young man into someone who would carry the weight of moral leadership. Morehouse was more than a school. It was a crucible where young black men were forged into leaders, taught that despite what segregation tried to tell them, they were heirs to a great tradition, bearers of enormous potential. The college's president, Dr. Benjamin Mays, became a figure of profound influence in Martin's life. Mays was a scholar and a preacher, a man who carried himself with such dignity and spoke with such eloquence that he embodied the very ideals he taught. Every Tuesday morning he gave chapel talks that were really meditations on life, character, faith, and social justice. Martin listened, absorbed, and began to see what a life of purpose might look like. At first, young Martin resisted the idea of following his father into the ministry. The church he had grown up in was emotional, full of what he considered excessive displays of feeling, shouting, ecstatic responses, a kind of fundamentalism that his increasingly educated mind found difficult to embrace. He wanted to be a doctor, perhaps, or a lawyer, something more intellectual, less fraught with what he saw as emotionalism. But slowly, gradually, he felt the pull, not toward the ministry as he had known it, but toward something else, toward the idea that faith could be intellectual and emotional both, that the church could be not just a place of personal salvation, but an instrument of social transformation. Dr. May showed him this possibility. Other professors deepened his thinking. Martin studied sociology, philosophy, literature. He read Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience and felt something stir within him. This idea that there were moral laws higher than the laws of the state, that conscience must sometimes lead to resistance. In his last year at Morehouse, Martin made his decision. He would enter the ministry, but it would be a ministry informed by education, by social consciousness, by a belief that the gospel had profound implications for how society should be organized. In February of 1948, at age 19, he was ordained as a Baptist minister. His father, Daddy King, performed the ordination at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and young Martin became assistant pastor, beginning to preach to the congregation he had known all his life. But he was hungry for more learning. That fall, he left Atlanta for Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. It was his first extended time living outside the segregated South, and the change was both freeing and disorienting. At Crozer, he was one of only a handful of black students among about 100 white seminarians. He excelled there, graduating at the top of his class, but he felt the pressure to represent his race, to be twice as good, to give no one any reason to dismiss him or his community. It was at Crozer that Martin's intellectual and spiritual foundations truly solidified. He studied the great theologians, Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, Walter Rauschenbusch. From Rauschenbusch, he absorbed the social gospel, the idea that Christianity must concern itself, not just with personal piety, but with social justice, that saving souls meant nothing if those souls lived in unjust condition. From Niebuhr, he learned about the complexity of human nature, the reality of sin and power, the need for both love and justice in confronting evil. And then, in a moment that would prove pivotal, he attended a lecture on Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi had led India to independence from British rule, not through violence but through moral force, through mass non-cooperation, through a willingness to suffer rather than inflict suffering. Martin was electrified. Here was a method, a practical, proven method, for confronting injustice without resorting to the very violence that oppression used. Here was a way to resist that was rooted in love, not hate. Here was a strategy that could honor both the Christian command to love one's enemies and the human need to resist evil. He began to see how it might work. This combination of Christian love and Gandhian nonviolence applied to the particular evil of American racial segregation. The pieces were coming together, though he did not yet know when or how they would be tested. After Crozer, Martin continued his education at Boston University, pursuing a doctorate in systematic theology. Boston was vibrant, intellectual, full of students and ideas, and it was there, in that city of learning, that Martin met Coretta Scott. She was from Alabama, studying voice at the New England Conservatory of Music. She was beautiful, graceful, intelligent, with dreams of her own, dreams of singing, of performing, of a life lived through music. A friend arranged a phone call between them, and Martin, ever forward, told her during that first conversation that she had all the qualities he was looking for in a wife. She was less immediately convinced, But there was something about his intensity, his sense of purpose that drew her. They courted through that Boston year, walking together through the city, talking about everything, about music and theology, about race and justice, about the South they had both left and the future they might share. Coretta gradually came to understand that marrying Martin Luther King Jr. would mean marrying not just a man, but a mission. He was going to return to the South. He was going to work for change. He would not choose the safer, easier path of staying north or pursuing a comfortable academic career. She had to decide if she could walk that path with him. In June of 1953, they were married at her family home in Alabama. Martin's father performed the ceremony. Coretta wore a gown of light blue waltz-length taffeta and nylon net. They stood together and made their vows, binding their lives, their futures, their fates. Martin completed his doctoral dissertation, a complex theological study comparing the conceptions of God in the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Vieman, while also beginning to look for a position. He received offers from universities, from churches in the North, where life would be safer, more comfortable. But he felt called to return south, to take his education back to the place that needed it most. In 1954, he accepted the pastorate at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. It was a small, dignified congregation, middle class, educated. The church sat just down the street from the state capitol building, where the Confederate flag still flew. Martin and Coretta moved to Montgomery that September, into the parsonage, a simple white house on South Jackson Street. He was 25 years old, newly married, newly arrived, settling into the rhythms of pastoral life. He visited the sick, counseled the troubled, prepared his sermons with meticulous care. He preached about faith and ethics, about personal transformation and social responsibility. His sermons were intellectual but accessible, drawing on philosophy and literature as easily as on scripture. The congregation appreciated his learning, his eloquence, his evident dedication. That first year passed in what seemed like ordinary pastoral work. A baby was born, Yolanda Denise, their first child, in November of 1955. The young family established routines, built connections in the community. Martin joined the local NAACP chapter, began to understand the particular shape of racial injustice in Montgomery. The segregated buses where black passengers paid at the front but had to enter through the back, where they stood even when seats in the white section sat empty, where drivers routinely insulted and humiliated them. He knew these injustices were wrong. He preached about dignity and justice, but he did not yet imagine that he would soon be thrust into the center of a struggle that would shake the nation. That this ordinary first year of pastoral ministry was the calm before a storm that would change everything. For him, for Montgomery, for America itself. History was gathering itself, preparing to break over Montgomery like a wave. And Martin Luther King Jr., settling into married life and fatherhood, studying, preaching, serving his small congregation, stood unknowing on the shore, about to be swept up into currents that would carry him far beyond anything he had imagined. Part 3. Montgomery. The movement begins. Evening was settling over Montgomery on December 1st, 1955. The workday was ending, and people were boarding buses to ride home through the winter dusk. On one of those buses, a seamstress named Rosa Parks paid her fare and took a seat in the middle section, the no-man's land where black passengers could sit if no white passengers needed the space. Rosa Parks was 42 years old, quiet in manner, but strong in spirit. She had been active in the local NAACP chapter, serving as secretary. She was tired that evening, not just physically tired from work at the Montgomery Fair department store, but tired in a deeper way, tired of the daily humiliations, the constant necessity of deferring and accommodating and diminishing oneself to navigate a system designed to demean. As the bus filled, a white man boarded and found no seat in the white section. The driver, following the custom and law, ordered the row where Rosa Parks sat to stand and move back. 3 other black passengers complied. Rosa Parks stayed seated. The driver asked her again. She refused, quietly. He threatened to call the police. She told him to do so. And so she sat, in that ordinary seat on that ordinary bus, and by sitting transformed an ordinary Thursday evening into a moment that would reverberate through history. The police came. They arrested her, fingerprinted her, charged her with violating Montgomery's segregation ordinance. The news spread quickly through Montgomery's black community. Here was an opportunity, not the first time someone had been arrested for refusing to give up a bus seat, but perhaps the right time, with the right person, to mount a challenge. The Women's Political Council, led by Joanne Robinson, sprang into action. That very night, they mimeographed thousands of leaflets calling for a one-day boycott of Montgomery's buses on Monday, December 5th, the day of Rosa Parks' trial. "Let us stay off the buses," the leaflets urged. "Let us walk. Let us share rides. Let us show our unity and our power." The black ministers of Montgomery met to discuss what should be done. They were cautious, some of them, worried about reprisals, about violence, about the risks of direct action, but they agreed to support the one-day boycott. Among those ministers was Martin Luther King Jr., newly arrived, not yet well known outside his own congregation. He was 26 years old, with an infant daughter at home, still working on completing his doctoral dissertation. He did not seek leadership in this crisis, but leadership sought him. Monday morning came cold and clear. Martin and Coretta woke early, anxious to see if the boycott would hold. The first bus was due to pass their house at 6 o'clock. They positioned themselves by the window and watched. The bus came, its headlights cutting through the dawn. It was empty, completely empty. They could hardly believe it. Another bus came, empty again. All morning, the buses rolled through Montgomery carrying nothing but air and the ghosts of their usual passengers. The boycott was total, astonishing in its completeness. 40,000 black citizens of Montgomery stayed off the buses. They walked, sometimes for miles. They caught rides with a few who owned cars. They organized carpools on the spot. They moved through the city on foot, in dignity, in unity, demonstrating a solidarity that even they had not been sure they possessed. That evening, there was a mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church to decide whether to continue the boycott beyond the single day. The church was packed. Thousands inside. Thousands more gathered outside listening through loudspeakers. The mood was electric with possibility and fear, both. Earlier that day, the ministers had hastily formed an organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, they called it, to coordinate the protest. They needed a president, and various names were suggested. The choice fell on Martin Luther King Jr., partly because he was new and had not yet been involved in the factional disputes that divided some of the other ministers, partly because those who had heard him preach recognized his gifts. He was elected, and he accepted, though he barely had time to process what this would mean. Now he stood to speak to the massive crowd. He had only 20 minutes to prepare, to think about what to say. He walked to the pulpit, looked out over the sea of faces, old and young, tired from a day of walking, hopeful that their sacrifice meant something. He began carefully, laying out the facts, the injustice of Rosa Parks' arrest, the larger injustice of the bus system. His voice was controlled, reasonable, building slowly. And then he said something that captured everything they were feeling. There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. The church erupted. Yes, they were tired. And this was not just tiredness. This was righteous exhaustion, holy fatigue, the kind of weariness that transforms into action. Martin continued, his voice rising, finding its rhythm. But even as he validated their anger, he steered them towards something else. This protest, he said, must be rooted in Christian love. They must resist the system, yes, but they must not hate the people trapped within it. They must not answer violence with violence, hate with hate. Love must be our regulating ideal. The crowd responded to this too, with equal fervor. They understood, in that moment, that what they were beginning was not just a protest, but a moral movement. Not just a boycott, but a witness to deeper truths about human dignity and divine justice. The vote was taken. The boycott would continue until the bus company agreed to 3 simple demands: courteous treatment of black passengers, first come, first served seating, with black passengers filling from the back and white passengers from the front, and the hiring of black bus drivers for predominantly black routes. These were modest demands, far short of full integration, but they were a beginning. And so the Montgomery Bus Boycott extended from one day to another, and then another, into weeks and months. The black community of Montgomery walked. They walked in rain and cold. They walked when their feet ached and their bodies cried out for rest. Elderly women who had never walked more than a few blocks walked miles. A reporter asked one old woman if she was tired. She replied, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Martin Luther King Jr. found himself thrust into a leadership role he had never sought. The Montgomery Improvement Association organized carpools, coordinated rides, held weekly mass meetings to keep spirits up. Martin spoke again and again, encouraging, explaining, keeping people focused on both the practical goal and the moral principle. He discovered that he had a gift for this, not just for speaking but for organizing, for bringing people together, for articulating a vision that was both practical and transcendent. But leadership came with a cost. The city officials fought back. They arrested carpool drivers for minor traffic violations. They indicted the boycott leaders under an old anti-boycott law. Martin himself was arrested, fingerprinted, jailed briefly. His first experience of incarceration, a bitter but ultimately strengthening experience. And there were threats, so many threats. Phone calls in the night, voices promising violence, death, letters filled with hatred. The pressure was immense, relentless. In late January, less than 2 months into the boycott, Martin reached a breaking point. It was near midnight. Another threatening phone call had come, another voice promising to blow up his house, to kill him and his family. He sat alone in his kitchen, too agitated to sleep, a cup of coffee growing cold before him. He put his head in his hands and prayed, not a formal prayer, but a cry of desperation. He told God he was afraid, that he was losing his courage, that he couldn't go on. And in that moment of utter surrender, he felt something he would later describe as a presence, a voice, an assurance that he was not alone, that he must go on, that justice was on their side. 3 nights later, a bomb exploded on his front porch. Coretta and baby Yolanda were inside but unharmed. An angry crowd gathered outside the damaged house, some armed, ready to respond with violence to violence. Martin came out, stood on what remained of his porch, and calmed them. "We must love our white brothers," he said. "No matter what they do to us, we must make them know that we love them." It was a defining moment. The philosophy of nonviolence was not just theoretical. It had to be practiced in the hardest moments, when every instinct cried out for retaliation. Martin held the line, and the crowd dispersed peacefully. The boycott stretched on. Months passed. The bus company was losing money, the buses rolling empty through the streets day after day. But city officials refused to negotiate seriously. So the case went to federal court, challenging the constitutionality of bus segregation itself. And while they waited for the courts, the people of Montgomery kept walking. Through spring and into summer, through summer into fall. It became a way of life, this walking. The mass meetings every Monday and Thursday became spaces of renewal, where people sang freedom songs and listened to Martin preach, and remembered why they were doing this, why the sacrifice mattered. Martin traveled too, speaking in churches and universities around the country, raising money for the carpool, telling Montgomery's story, learning that what was happening in his city resonated far beyond its borders. He was becoming, though he barely had time to realize it, a national figure, a symbol of a movement that was larger than any individual, but that needed individuals to articulate its meaning. Finally, in November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation was unconstitutional. The news came to Martin while he was in the middle of a Montgomery Improvement Association meeting. Someone rushed in with a bulletin from the radio. The room erupted in joy, in tears, in prayers of thanksgiving. The boycott had lasted 381 days. 381 days of walking, of organizing, of nonviolent resistance. 381 days that transformed a local protest into a blueprint for a movement. On December 21st, Martin and a group of ministers and civil rights leaders boarded a Montgomery bus and sat in the front seats. The bus driver, the same one who had driven the route for years, greeted them politely. Martin looked out the window as the bus moved through the city he had come to know so intimately through months of struggle. They had finally won. Not everything, not yet, but something important. They had proven that ordinary people, united in purpose, willing to sacrifice, committed to nonviolence, could change what seemed unchangeable. Montgomery taught Martin Luther King Jr. what he could do. It taught him that leadership was not something you sought, but something you accepted when history called. It taught him that people would sacrifice enormously if given a vision worth sacrificing for. It taught him that nonviolence could work, that it was not weakness, but a powerful force for change. It taught him that he had been given gifts of speech, of organization, of moral clarity, and that those gifts carried obligations. He was no longer just a young pastor in Alabama. He was a leader of a movement that was just beginning, a movement that would demand everything he had to give, and then more. Part 4. The Work Deepens. The success in Montgomery rippled outward, creating waves that reached far beyond Alabama's borders. Martin Luther King Jr. found himself suddenly visible, sought after, burdened with new responsibilities that he could not have imagined just 2 years earlier. But he accepted them, understanding that Montgomery was not an ending but a beginning. In January of 1957, King and other civil rights leaders gathered in Atlanta to form a new organization. They called it the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. Its purpose was to coordinate nonviolent direct action campaigns across the South, to spread the lessons of Montgomery, to challenge segregation wherever it stood. Martin was elected president, a role he would hold for the rest of his life. The CLC became his vehicle for the broader movement. It was rooted in the Black church, drawing on the moral authority and organizational infrastructure that churches provided. It was committed to nonviolence not just as a tactic but as a philosophy, a way of life. And it was focused on action, not just talking about justice but actively confronting injustice through boycotts, sit-ins, marches, demonstrations. But leadership of a growing movement meant constant travel, endless meetings, persistent danger. Martin crisscrossed the South and the nation, speaking, organizing, raising funds, encouraging local activists. He barely saw his family. Coretta managed the household, raised their growing family. Yolanda was joined by Martin Luther III in 1957, then Dexter Scott in 1961, and Bernice Albertine in 1963. She handled the threatening phone calls, the constant disruptions, the fear that every time Martin left, he might not return. She had sacrificed her own dreams of a music career to support his calling, and it was not always easy, but she carried her role with grace and strength. In September of 1958, Martin published his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, recounting the story of the Montgomery boycott. He was in Harlem, in a department store signing copies, when a woman approached him. She asked if he was Martin Luther King. He said yes. She pulled out a letter opener and plunged it into his chest. The blade lodged against his aorta. Surgeons later told him that if he had sneezed, if he had moved wrong, the blade would have pierced the artery and he would have died. As it was, they had to remove one of his ribs and part of his breastbone to extract the weapon. He spent weeks recovering, time to think, to read, to reflect on how quickly life could end, how fragile existence was. While he recovered, he received thousands of letters and cards from well-wishers. One letter, from a young white girl, particularly moved him. She wrote that she was so happy he hadn't sneezed. That phrase stayed with him, became part of his mental furniture. He hadn't sneezed. He was still alive. There was still work to do. And the work was hard, grinding, often discouraging. Progress was slow. For every victory, there were setbacks. White citizens' councils organized throughout the South, pledging massive resistance to integration. The Ku Klux Klan rode again, burning crosses, bombing churches, attacking anyone who challenged the racial order. Politicians from the county courthouse to the governor's mansion vowed that segregation would be maintained forever. But the movement kept pushing. In 1960, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a segregated lunch counter and refused to leave. Their action sparked a wave of sit-ins across the South. Young people, most of them college students, many of them teenagers, occupied lunch counters, department stores, libraries, demanding to be served, willing to be arrested. They were beaten, spat upon, burned with cigarettes, cursed with language so vile it shocked even those used to the South's casual racism. And they kept sitting, kept returning, kept insisting on their dignity. Martin supported these young activists, advised them, bailed them out of jail. He recognized in them the same spirit that had animated Montgomery, but with an impatience, an urgency that his generation had not quite possessed. They formed their own organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, and they pushed the movement forward with their youth and their courage and their willingness to risk everything. Martin himself participated in sit-ins, most famously in Atlanta, in October of 1960. He was arrested and sentenced to 4 months of hard labor, a punishment absurdly harsh for a misdemeanor charge of trespassing. The case gained national attention, especially when presidential candidate John F. Kennedy calling Coretta King to express his concern, and having his brother Robert work behind the scenes to secure Martin's release. That intervention likely won Kennedy the election by securing black votes. Politics and civil rights were becoming intertwined in ways that would grow more complex and fraught as the decade progressed. In 1961 came the Freedom Rides. Black and white activists rode interstate buses through the South, testing the Supreme Court ruling that had outlawed segregation in interstate travel facilities. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob firebombed a bus. In Birmingham, another mob beat the riders with baseball bats and iron pipes while police stood by. The images shocked the nation and the world. Martin offered support and encouragement, though he did not ride himself, a decision some of the younger activists quietly resented. The Kennedy administration, embarrassed by the international publicity, pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce desegregation of bus terminals. It was a victory, though one purchased with the blood and broken bones of brave young people. But the larger structures of segregation remained intact. Schools were still segregated. Voting rights were still denied to most black Southerners through a maze of literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation. Economic inequality was vast and entrenched. The work was endless, and Martin was struggling under the weight of it. The constant travel exhausted him. The threats never stopped. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had begun investigating him, suspicious of communist influence in the civil rights movement, ultimately fixating on King himself. They wiretapped his phones, his hotel rooms. They collected information, some true, some exaggerated, some fabricated, building a file intended to discredit and destroy him. Martin suffered from insomnia, from depression at times, from the sheer psychic burden of knowing that any mistake he made would be used against the movement. He felt the weight of expectations from his followers, from his critics, from history itself. He was only in his early 30s, but felt decades older. Yet, he kept going. He preached almost every Sunday, wherever he was. He wrote articles, speeches, books. He met with presidents and with sharecroppers, with celebrities, and with anonymous citizens. He listened to people's stories of suffering and hope. He tried to be what they needed him to be, even when he wasn't sure who that was anymore. In late 1962 and early 1963, the SNCC planned a major campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was perhaps the most segregated city in America, ruled by an iron-fisted commissioner of public safety named Eugene Bull Connor. The city's resistance to any change was absolute, its violence towards civil rights activists legendary. Martin and his colleagues knew Birmingham would be a test. They called it Project CC for confrontation. The plan was to launch a direct action campaign, boycotts, sit-ins, marches, designed to create a crisis that would force the city to negotiate. They would fill the jails with protesters, overwhelm the system, demonstrate the injustice so dramatically that the nation could not look away. The campaign began in April of 1963. Martin and his colleagues organized daily marches, daily sit-ins. They were arrested again and again. Bull Connor unleashed his police force, attacking peaceful demonstrators with nightsticks and dogs. On Good Friday, April 12th, Martin was arrested. In his cell, alone, he read a newspaper article by white clergymen criticizing the Birmingham campaign, calling it unwise and untimely, urging patience, moderation, waiting for a better time. In the margins of that newspaper, and then on scraps of paper smuggled to him, Martin began to write. He wrote what would become known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, one of the most powerful documents in American history. In it, he explained why they could not wait, why patience in the face of injustice was itself a form of complicity, why direct action was necessary. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, he wrote, his hand cramped from writing in the dim light. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. He explained the philosophy of nonviolent direct action, how you negotiate when possible, but when negotiation fails, you create tension, force a crisis, make the injustice so visible that it must be addressed. He wrote about the difference between just and unjust laws, about the moral obligation to disobey unjust laws. He wrote with the urgency of someone who had seen too much suffering, waited too long, lost too much hope in the promises of gradualism. The letter was smuggled out, piece by piece, and published. It became a manifesto, a teaching document, a window into the moral logic of the movement. But Birmingham required more than words. After Martin was released, the campaign intensified. And then they made a decision that would prove both controversial and effective. They asked the children to march. On May 2nd, more than 1,000 black children and teenagers left their schools and marched into downtown Birmingham. They were organized, trained in nonviolence, prepared to be arrested. And arrested they were, filling the jails to overflowing, so many children that the authorities ran out of places to put them. The next day, more children marched, and this time, Bull Connor had had enough. He ordered fire hoses turned on the young marchers, hoses with pressure strong enough to strip bark from trees, to knock adults off their feet. He unleashed police dogs that lunged and bit. All of this happened in front of television cameras, in front of newspaper photographers. The images went around the world. Children being knocked down by water cannons, teenagers being attacked by dogs. A nation that prided itself on its values saw the reality of its injustice made visible in the most undeniable way through the suffering of its children. The pressure became unbearable. President Kennedy spoke out forcefully for the first time. Businesses in Birmingham, facing economic pressure and moral shame, finally agreed to negotiate. On May 10th, an agreement was reached. Lunch counters would be desegregated, restrooms and fitting rooms opened, hiring practices changed, arrested protesters released. It was a victory, though purchased at enormous cost. And it was incomplete. That very night, bombs exploded at Martin's brother's house and at the motel where Martin had been staying, provoking a riot that required federal troops to restore order. But Birmingham had changed something fundamental. It had demonstrated that nonviolent direct action could work even in the most resistant places. It had shown the nation the face of its own injustice, and it had propelled Martin Luther King Jr. into a new role. No longer just a civil rights leader, but a moral voice for the entire nation. Someone whose words and actions carried weight far beyond the black community, far beyond the South. The momentum from Birmingham carried them forward. Plans were made for a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C., a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. It would be the largest civil rights demonstration in American history, a gathering designed to put pressure on Congress to pass meaningful civil rights legislation. Part 5. The Dream and Its Aftermath. Summer heat lay heavy over Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963. It was a Wednesday, and the city had braced itself with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Organizers hoped for 100,000 marchers. Police and federal troops were positioned throughout the capital, ready for potential violence, expecting chaos. But what unfolded instead was something like a miracle of collective will. They came from everywhere, from nearby cities and distant states, by bus and train, in car and plane. They came in church groups and union delegations, families and friends, the elderly and the young. They came black and white together, though overwhelmingly black, a river of people flowing toward the Lincoln Memorial, where Abraham Lincoln sat in marble stillness, watching over a promise not yet fulfilled. By noon, it was clear the crowd was far larger than anyone had imagined. Not 100,000, but 250,000 people gathered on the National Mall, spreading from the Lincoln Memorial toward the Washington Monument. It was the largest political gathering in American history to that point. And it was peaceful, joyful even, people singing, listening to speeches, sharing food, united in purpose and hope. Martin Luther King Jr. was scheduled to speak last, after a long afternoon of other speakers, performers, organizers. He had worked on his speech for days, writing and rewriting, consulting with advisors. The speech he prepared was strong, solid, calling for justice, demanding action from Congress, reviewing the broken promises and unfinished business of emancipation. As the afternoon stretched on, the speeches began to blur together, powerful but predictable. Then gospel singer Mahalia Jackson sang, her voice soaring over the crowd, and something shifted in the atmosphere, something electric and spiritual both. Finally, Martin was introduced. He walked to the podium, looked out over that vast sea of faces, and began to speak. He started with his prepared remarks, his voice strong and measured, making the case for civil rights legislation, for jobs and freedom, for justice delayed no longer. But as he spoke, Mahalia Jackson, standing nearby, called out to him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." She was referring to something Martin had spoken about before in other speeches, a theme he had developed, the dream of equality, of justice, of an America that lived up to its ideals. And in that moment, Martin set aside his prepared text. He began to speak from his heart, from his deepest convictions, drawing on the language of Scripture and the Declaration of Independence, on the songs of the church and the promises of democracy. "I have a dream," he said, and the words rang out over the mall, carried by loudspeakers to the edges of the crowd and beyond, to radios and televisions across the nation. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." He spoke of a dream where his children would be judged, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He spoke of mountains made low and valleys exalted, of rough places made plain, of the glory of the Lord revealed. He spoke of freedom ringing from every mountainside, from every state, until all of God's children could join hands and sing in the words of the old spiritual. "Free at last, free at last, free at last." The speech lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, the crowd stood in something like stunned silence for a moment, and then erupted, not in riot but in joy, in affirmation, in hope that perhaps the dream might actually be possible. The March on Washington became a defining moment in American history. The speech became one of the most famous ever delivered. Martin Luther King Jr. became not just a civil rights leader, but an American icon, his words taught in schools, his vision claimed by the nation. But the euphoria did not last long. 18 days later, on September 15th, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. It was Sunday morning, and children were in the basement preparing for worship. The blast killed 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. The youngest was 11 years old. Martin rushed to Birmingham, sick with grief and rage. He preached at the funeral, trying to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in the murder of children. He spoke of their innocence, their sacrifice, the evil that had taken them. He tried to channel his anger into resolve, to honor their deaths by continuing the work they had died for. But something had broken inside him. The oscillation between hope and horror, between the dream of August and the nightmare of September, between national acclaim and local violence, it was becoming unbearable. He struggled with despair more openly now, wondered if nonviolence could truly overcome the depth of hatred arrayed against them. Yet the movement continued. President Kennedy proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation. Before it could be passed, Kennedy himself was assassinated in November, shocking the nation yet again with violence. But his successor, Lyndon Johnson, took up the cause with unexpected vigor. Johnson had been a segregationist senator from Texas, but as president, he became, of all improbable things, a champion of civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was debated through the winter and spring. It was the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It desegregated public facilities, strengthened voting rights enforcement, prohibited employment discrimination. In July, President Johnson signed it into law. Martin Luther King Jr. stood behind him at the signing ceremony, along with other civil rights leaders. It was a victory, enormous and hard-won. But even as the pen scratched across the paper, Martin knew it was not enough. Legal equality on paper did not mean justice in practice. Voting rights were still systematically denied across the South. Economic inequality remained vast. The work was far from finished. That fall, Martin was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming at 35 the youngest person ever to receive it. He traveled to Oslo, Norway, in December to accept the award. In his acceptance speech, he spoke of nonviolence, of faith, of the long arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. He donated the entire prize money, $54,000, to the civil rights movement. The honor was gratifying, but also overwhelming. The expectations placed on him grew heavier. He was exhausted, running on reserves he wasn't sure he had. He suffered from insomnia, from anxiety, from what we would now recognize as depression. The FBI's harassment intensified. They sent him anonymous letters suggesting he should commit suicide. They tried to break up his marriage. They worked to isolate him from allies and supporters. But in early 1965, the movement turned its attention to voting rights, focusing on Selma, Alabama, where black citizens faced the most extreme obstacles to registering to vote. Despite comprising half the county's population, only 2% of eligible black voters were registered, blocked by rigged literacy tests, economic intimidation, and outright violence. The CLC organized a campaign in Selma, registering voters, organizing marches. On February 18th, a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot by state troopers during a peaceful march. He died 8 days later. In response, organizers planned a march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, a 54-mile journey. On March 7th, a day that would become known as Bloody Sunday, about 600 marchers set out from Selma, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge out of town. At the other end of the bridge, Alabama state troopers and local police waited. As the marchers approached, the troopers attacked without warning, charging with nightsticks, firing tear gas, beating people to the ground, trampling them with horses. Television cameras captured it all. The images, broadcast that night on national television, shocked the conscience of America. People who had been indifferent to civil rights, who had thought the movement was moving too fast or asking too much, saw peaceful citizens being beaten simply for trying to march. The brutality was undeniable, the injustice impossible to ignore. Martin, who had not been present for the first march, led a second attempt 2 days later. But federal authorities, worried about violence, had obtained an injunction against the march. Martin faced an impossible dilemma: proceed and risk not just violence, but a court ruling that would set back the movement, or turn back and disappoint the hundreds who had come to march. He led the marchers to the bridge, knelt in prayer, and then turned around, a decision that angered some of the more militant activists. Finally, after more negotiations, and with federal protection secured, a third march took place, beginning on March 21st. This time they made it. Martin walked at the front, alongside other civil rights leaders and religious figures from around the country who had come to Selma in solidarity. For 5 days they walked along Highway 80, camping in fields at night, arriving in Montgomery on March 25th to a rally of 25,000 people. Martin spoke from the steps of the Alabama State Capitol, the same building that had celebrated the Confederacy, the same building where Jefferson Davis had taken his oath as president of that short-lived nation, built on slavery. Now Martin stood there and proclaimed that segregation was dying, that the arc of the moral universe was indeed bending toward justice, that they would overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That night, Viola Liuzzo, a white activist from Michigan who had come to Selma to help, was murdered by Ku Klux Klan members as she drove marchers back to Selma. The victory and the tragedy intertwined again, inseparable. But Selma had achieved its purpose. The brutality on the Edmund Pettus Bridge had galvanized national opinion. President Johnson addressed Congress and the nation, speaking forcefully in favor of voting rights legislation, even using the movement's own phrase, "We shall overcome," he said, his Texas drawl wrapping around words usually sung by black protesters. In August, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It eliminated literacy tests, authorized federal oversight of voter registration in areas with a history of discrimination, and fundamentally transformed American democracy by making it possible for black citizens to actually exercise their constitutional right to vote. Within months, voter registration in the South began to climb dramatically. Part 6. New Battles, Deeper Questions. After Selma, Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the pinnacle of his influence. He had led successful campaigns in Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma. He had delivered one of history's most famous speeches. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Civil rights and voting rights legislation had passed Congress. He was 36 years old, and it seemed as though the movement he had helped build had achieved its major goals. But Martin knew better. Legal victories were essential, but insufficient. They had torn down the formal structure of segregation, but they had barely touched the deeper realities of poverty, economic exploitation, residential segregation in the North, police brutality, unemployment, inadequate education, and healthcare. The movement needed to evolve to address these structural injustices. In early 1966, Martin moved his family to Chicago, into a tenement apartment in the city's West Side slums. He wanted to understand Northern poverty firsthand, to bring the movement's energy to bear on the problems of urban ghettos. Chicago would be his laboratory for a new phase of activism. The Chicago campaign focused on housing discrimination and economic injustice. Martin organized rallies and marches demanding open housing, the right of black families to live wherever they could afford, not just in designated segregated neighborhoods. But Chicago proved far more difficult than the South. In the South, the enemy had been clear: segregationist politicians, explicitly racist laws. In the North, racism was subtler, embedded in economic structures, real estate practices, white ethnic communities that violently resisted integration. When Martin led marches through white neighborhoods like Marquette Park and Gage Park, he encountered hatred as intense as anything he had seen in Alabama. White residents threw rocks and bottles, screamed obscenities, waved Confederate flags and Nazi symbols. Martin was hit by a rock during one march. He later said, "I have seen many demonstrations in the South, but I have never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today." The Chicago campaign achieved some modest victories, agreements on fair housing practices from city officials and real estate companies, but they felt hollow, difficult to enforce. Martin grew frustrated with the limits of what he could accomplish. The northern problems were more complex, more interwoven with economic systems, harder to address through marches and demonstrations alone. Meanwhile, another issue was demanding his attention: the war in Vietnam. The United States had been escalating its military involvement in Southeast Asia, sending hundreds of thousands of troops, dropping more bombs than had been used in all of World War II. The war was consuming resources that Martin believed should be used to fight poverty at home. It was disproportionately killing young black men who were drafted in higher numbers than whites and sent to fight for freedoms abroad that they did not fully enjoy at home. Martin agonized over whether to speak out against the war. His advisors were divided. Some argued he should stick to civil rights, that opposing the war would alienate President Johnson, lose political support, divide the movement. Others insisted that as a moral leader, as a minister, as a proponent of nonviolence, he could not remain silent about a war he believed was unjust. On April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York City, Martin delivered a speech called Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. In it, he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He connected racism, poverty, and militarism as interrelated evils that needed to be confronted together. He spoke as a minister, as a citizen, as a human being who could not separate his concern for civil rights from his concern for peace. The reaction was swift and harsh. Major newspapers condemned him. Political allies distanced themselves. Even some civil rights leaders criticized him for straying from their issue. But Martin believed he had no choice. His conscience had led him into the civil rights movement. That same conscience would not let him stay silent about war. Through 1967 and into 1968, Martin worked on developing a new campaign, the Poor People's Campaign. His vision had expanded beyond civil rights to economic justice. He wanted to organize poor people of all races, black, white, Latino, Native American, to come to Washington and demand that the government address poverty through guaranteed employment or income, affordable housing, quality education. It was an ambitious, some said impossible, goal. But the movement was fracturing. Younger activists, frustrated with the pace of change, were turning away from nonviolence. The Black Power movement, with its emphasis on self-defense, black pride, and racial solidarity, was gaining strength. Organizations like the Black Panthers advocated armed self-defense. After summers of urban riots in Newark, Detroit, and other cities, many questioned whether nonviolence could address the rage and desperation of the ghettos. Martin understood the anger, even sympathized with it. But he held to nonviolence, not as a tactic merely, but as a philosophy, a moral principle, a spiritual discipline. He argued that riots were counterproductive, that violence would only bring more violence, that the path to justice had to be different from the path of oppression. Still, he was tired. So tired. He was only 39 but looked older, worn down by the years of struggle, the constant travel, the threats, the assassinations. John Kennedy, Malcolm X, and others. He suffered from insomnia, from nightmares. He spoke more often about death, seemed almost to be preparing for it. In March of 1968, Martin traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to support striking sanitation workers. The workers, almost all black men, were paid poverty wages, forced to work in dangerous conditions without adequate equipment. 2 workers had been crushed to death in a garbage truck. The strikers carried signs reading simply, "I am a man," a claim to basic human dignity that the city refused to recognize. Martin saw, in their struggle, a perfect example of the intersection of racism and economic injustice. He spoke to a rally of striking workers and their supporters, promising to return to lead a march on their behalf. He came back on March 28th to lead that march. But it turned violent when some young people began breaking windows and looting. Police responded with tear gas and violence. Martin, horrified that a march he had led had turned violent, was rushed away to safety. He was devastated. He felt he had failed, that his commitment to nonviolence had been undermined. He returned to Memphis in early April, determined to lead a peaceful march, to prove that nonviolence could still work. On April 3rd, he spoke at a rally at the Mason Temple. A thunderstorm raged outside. Martin had not planned to speak. He was tired, unwell. But his colleague Ralph Abernathy called from the church and said the crowd was demanding to hear from him. So he went. What he delivered that night became known as the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. It was as though he knew, sensed what was coming. He spoke about the movement's long journey, the victories and setbacks. He spoke about threats against his life, about the bomb that had been called in that very day threatening his plane. And then he said something remarkable. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. His voice rose, powerful, transcendent. He seemed to be looking beyond the moment, beyond himself, seeing something the rest could not quite see. And then he finished. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The crowd responded with shouts and tears and amens. Martin sat down, drained, as though he had given everything. Part 7. The End and the Beginning. The next day was Thursday, April 4th, 1968. The weather had cleared after the previous night's storms, and Memphis was bright with spring. Martin stayed at the Lorraine Motel, a modest establishment frequented by black travelers in the segregated South. His room was on the second floor, number 306, overlooking the motel courtyard and parking lot. The day passed in meetings and phone calls, planning for the upcoming march, working on logistics for the Poor People's Campaign. Evening came. Martin got ready for dinner, putting on a suit and tie. He was in good spirits, joking with his colleagues and friends. At 6 o'clock, he stepped out onto the balcony outside his room. The air was cooling, pleasant. In the parking lot below, his driver was waiting to take them to dinner at the home of a local minister. Martin leaned on the railing, talking with friends below, calling out to the musician Ben Branch to play a certain song at the meeting that night. "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," one of his favorites. A single shot rang out. Martin Luther King Jr. fell, struck in the jaw and neck by a bullet fired from a boarding house across the street. His companions rushed to him. He lay on the balcony, blood pooling around his head. Someone called for an ambulance. Ralph Abernathy cradled his friend, pleading with him to hold on. They rushed him to St. Joseph's Hospital. Doctors worked desperately to save him, but the wound was too severe. The bullet had severed his spinal cord, shattered his jaw, damaged beyond repair. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The news spread with terrible swiftness. Within hours, the entire nation knew. President Johnson went on television, his face grim, calling for calm even as he acknowledged the tragedy. Robert Kennedy, campaigning for president, learned of the assassination just before he was to speak at a rally in Indianapolis. He broke the news to the crowd, many of whom had not yet heard, and gave an impromptu speech, raw, grief-stricken, beautiful in its humanity, calling for understanding and peace. But in many cities, there was not peace. There was rage, grief, and fire. Over the next week, riots erupted in more than 100 cities. Buildings burned. People died. The National Guard was called out. Washington, D.C., where Martin had delivered his dream just 5 years earlier, filled with smoke and soldiers. It was as though the nation was tearing itself apart, unable to contain the pain and fury of this latest wound. They caught a man, James Earl Ray, a petty criminal and racist who pleaded guilty to the murder. Many suspected there might have been a larger conspiracy, but Ray's conviction closed the official case. Whether he acted alone or as part of something larger, the result was the same. Martin Luther King Jr. was gone. The funeral was held in Atlanta on April 9th. It was vast, solemn, painful beyond words. Dignitaries came from around the world. But so did ordinary people, tens of thousands of them, lining the streets as a simple farm wagon pulled by mules. Martin had requested simplicity, carried his casket from the church to the cemetery. They sang "We Shall Overcome" through tears. They mourned not just a man, but a dream that felt suddenly more distant, less certain. Coretta Scott King stood with her 4 children, dignified in her grief, already beginning to think about how to carry forward her husband's legacy. She would spend the rest of her long life doing exactly that, establishing the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, working for civil rights and peace, ensuring that his dream did not die with him. The Poor People's Campaign went forward that summer without Martin. Thousands came to Washington, set up a tent city on the National Mall called Resurrection City, demanded attention to poverty. But without Martin's leadership, without his ability to articulate the vision and mobilize support, the campaign achieved little. It ended in failure and recriminations, a sad coda to a life that deserved better. Part 8. Legacy, the Long Echo. Now, let your mind drift forward through time, through the years that followed Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, through decades of change both dramatic and incremental, until we arrive at our own present moment, where we can look back and see the shape of his legacy, the ways his life and work continue to ripple outward through history. In the immediate aftermath of his assassination, it seemed possible that everything he had worked for might collapse. The riots, the divisions within the movement, the rise of more militant activism, the backlash against civil rights, all of it suggested that perhaps nonviolence had failed, that the dream had been only that, a dream. But time revealed something different. The legal victories Martin had helped achieve, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, these transformed American society in fundamental ways. Within a generation, formal segregation had been dismantled, schools integrated, however imperfectly, public accommodations open to all, voting rights expanded dramatically, and black political power grew. African Americans were elected to positions at every level of government, including, eventually, the presidency itself. The moral framework Martin articulated, the idea that people should be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, became, at least nominally, the accepted standard. Overt racism became socially unacceptable in most contexts, driven to the margins rather than sitting comfortably at the center of American life. Nonviolent resistance, as a method for social change, influenced movements around the world. In South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement drew on Martin's teachings. In Eastern Europe, dissidents opposing communist regimes found inspiration in his example. In countless local struggles for justice, his speeches were quoted, his methods adapted, his spirit invoked. Of course, the dream was not fully realized. Racism did not disappear. It adapted, became more subtle, embedded itself in structures and systems rather than laws. Economic inequality persisted, and in some ways worsened. Police brutality continued to claim black lives. Residential segregation remained a reality in American cities. The mass incarceration of black and brown people became a defining feature of late 20th and early 21st century America. Martin himself had grown increasingly radical in his final years, more willing to critique capitalism and militarism, more focused on economic justice and structural change. But in death, he was often sanitized, reduced to the "I have a dream" speech, claimed by people who would have opposed his actual positions, transformed into a safe symbol rather than remembered as the radical prophet he was. Yet his essential message endured, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that we are all bound together in an inescapable network of mutuality, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, if people are willing to do the hard work of bending it. Every year on the third Monday in January, the United States observes Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a federal holiday dedicated to his memory and to service. Schools close. Government offices close. People volunteer, reflect, remember. It is the only federal holiday honoring a person of color, the only one honoring a private citizen who was never president. Statues of Martin stand in Washington and around the world. Streets bear his name in thousands of cities. Schools teach his speeches. His words are quoted by presidents and protesters alike, sometimes sincerely, sometimes cynically, but always with the recognition that they matter, that they carry weight. More importantly, the spirit he represented, the courage to stand for justice despite personal cost, the commitment to nonviolence even when violence seems justified, the faith that change is possible if people work together. This spirit lives on in every movement for justice. Every person who chooses to resist oppression through moral force, rather than violence. When we see people marching peacefully for their rights, we see Martin's influence. When we hear leaders calling for justice and reconciliation, we hear echoes of his voice. When ordinary people find the courage to stand up to systems that demean and exploit them, we witness the continuation of the work he began. His life was cut short, brutally and senselessly. He never grew old, never saw his children grown, never knew how far his influence would reach. But in another sense, his life continues, woven into the ongoing struggle for justice, alive wherever people refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable, wherever they choose hope over despair, love over hate, unity over division. Closing words. Rest now in the dream. And so we come to the end of this story, though of course it is not really an ending but a pause, a resting place in a narrative that continues to unfold. Let yourself settle more deeply now into the comfort of where you lie. Feel the softness beneath you, the weight of blankets, the quiet of this hour. Outside, the world continues its turning, but here, in this moment, there is peace. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man. Only a man, not a saint, not perfect, but human in all the ways that matter. He doubted and feared. He grew tired and discouraged. He made mistakes. He struggled with the weight of expectation and leadership. But he kept going, kept choosing courage when courage was hard, kept choosing love when hate would have been easier. His life teaches us that history is not made by superhuman heroes, but by ordinary people who make extraordinary choices, who do the next right thing even when the outcome is uncertain, who trust that their small actions might join with others to create something larger than themselves. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself rest in the knowledge that the work continues. The dream he articulated, of a world where people are valued for who they are rather than how they look, where justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, where children can grow up free from the shadow of discrimination and violence. That dream still calls to us, still waits to be fully realized. But it will be realized if we choose to make it so, if we do the patient, unglamorous work of building justice day by day, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. The arc is long, but it bends. We have seen it bend. We can help it bend further. So rest now. Let the story settle into your bones. Let the images fade into the gentle darkness behind your eyes. Feel gratitude for the courage of those who came before, who marched and sang and sacrificed, so that we might inherit a more just world. Feel hope for what is yet to come, for the work that will be done by generations not yet born. Breathe slowly, in and out. Let your muscles release their tension. Let your mind grow quiet. Somewhere, in some city tonight, someone is organizing, working for justice in quiet ways that will not make headlines, but that matter enormously. Somewhere, someone is choosing to speak up for what is right despite the cost. Somewhere, a child is learning that they have worth and dignity and power. The dream continues. The work continues. But for now, for this night, you can rest. You can sleep knowing that the struggle for justice is not yours alone to carry, that it is shared across time and space by countless others, that every person who chooses love over hate, justice over convenience, community over isolation, is part of something beautiful and enduring. Let the gentle rain of these words wash over you one last time. Let the memory of Martin's voice, strong yet gentle, urgent yet patient, calling us always toward our better selves, let that voice become part of the fabric of your sleep, part of the dreams that will carry you through the night. We shall overcome. Not today, perhaps. Not tomorrow, but someday. The moral universe bends toward justice because people like Martin Luther King Jr. put their hands on it and pull. And we can pull too, in our own ways, in our own time. But not now. Now is for rest. Sleep well, dream deeply, and wake tomorrow with renewed strength for whatever justice work calls to you. However large or small, the legacy continues. The dream endures. And you are part of it, simply by choosing to learn, to remember, to care. Rest now in that knowledge. Rest now in peace. Sleep.